It was as if we were transported in time as we arrived at the stunningly beautiful campus of the American University of Sharjah. I felt a sense of nostalgia and really wanted to go back to school. We then slowly navigated our way to Sheraa, the Sharjah Entrepreneurship Center. Sheraa is a wonderful ecosystem, an innovation lab, a home for aspiring, dreamy-eyed but determined startups to establish their businesses. Here we sat down with Najla Al-Midfa, its general manager and one of the inspirations behind this amazing initiative. Najla was born and raised in Sharjah. Her amazing career spans many continents, and she worked for companies like McKinsey, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Shell, and even Google. Her passion to support the local community and Emiratis, she worked for Khalifa Fund and is the founder of Khayarat. She also sits on the board of United Arab Bank and Sharjah Business Women's Council. Najla is a worthy mentor and an exceptional role model, particularly for all the young people in the region. She's a graduate from the University of Bath and an MBA from Stanford University. We are deeply honored and privileged to be here in this beautiful campus, this stunningly beautiful place that we are here at the American University of Sharjah. We're right next to the library and we're inside Sheraa. And there are a lot of things that are wonderful about this place, but even more interestingly and more importantly, we have one of the founders, one of the creators of this amazing initiative for entrepreneurs and for young people. And today we have Najla Al-Midfa, one of my favorite people here in Sharjah, even though she hasn't seen me that much.
Only in Sharjah.
No, only in Sharjah. Not only in Sharjah, one of my all-time favorite people.
Of the three people you know in Sharjah.
Of the three people I know in Sharjah, yes, this is true. Okay. But I'm saying that honestly, because there are not many people that I know here, but you always come across as being very special and very authentic and very real, and those are values that I respect a lot.
Thank you.
But thank you for welcoming us here.
Thanks a lot, Lara. It's a pleasure to be part of the series.
Thank you, thank you. So, Najla, I mean, this is your dream, this is your environment. When you were a little kid running around in little schools here and there, what did you think of? What did you imagine your life to be at this stage of your life?
Well, I certainly didn't imagine it would be this. I had a very different childhood. We were talking about generation gaps, and perhaps I was one of the last of the previous generation who enjoyed the more traditional childhood of, riding bikes and, playing outside and going over to the neighbor's house and so on, which you don't see as much, nowadays. We didn't have any smartphones and laptops and computers and DVDs and all of these things. So I had a very different childhood, and even in terms of the possibilities, the possibilities that I knew of as a child were the traditional career paths of, there's a doctor and the accountant and, lawyer, and obviously, my dad had a government role, so the government sector. But I could never imagine that, entrepreneurship, for example, was a career path, or enabling or empowering youth was a career path. So it's certainly not what I expected, but it's actually better than I expected, let's say. I'm really, really happy and proud to be at this point.
Wonderful. Were there any moments of inspiration, early inspiration in your life, somebody, some person or some event that guided you and shaped you?
I think all along my journey, there have been sources of inspiration, and I continue to try and seek out those sources of inspiration everywhere I go, irrespective of who I'm surrounded by. One of the stories that definitely inspired me, just as an example, this was actually when I graduated from university, just graduated from my undergraduate. I wanted to do some volunteer work, and so I was volunteering with Make-A-Wish Foundation over here, and met a very special girl named Adari, who had a terminal illness, and we got very close. And again, you may assume, well, she's 11 years old, and you're 20, and there's not much to learn there. But there was so much I learned from her in terms of being patient, in terms of always looking at the positive side of life, in terms of being nurturing. She was a lovely person, So whether it's that, whether it's the youth that I work with today, I'm constantly learning from them. and whether it's obviously the more traditional mentors, you know, managers that I've had, leaders I've worked for. Sheikh Bidour, for example, who is the chairperson of the Sharjah Entrepreneurship Center, is also someone I look up to very much. And so all along my journey, I feel that I've been very fortunate to have these sources of inspiration, to have mentors along the way that have guided me one step at a time. And of course, family. Was I naughty?
Were you a naughty child?
I mean, of course, it depends on who you ask. My parents may have a different view, but genuinely, if you look at report cards, another thing that has changed, all the report cards were handwritten in those days.
Yes.
If you look at them all, it was basically that I was a very quiet person. I was a shy. I could probably go through an entire academic year without saying a single word in class, unless I was specifically asked to say something. So I was actually a very, very shy child, and I still consider myself somewhat of an introvert, but obviously, you know, I've kind of come out of that shell and learned to be more confident and so on. So that's been a journey. But yeah, I definitely wasn't a naughty child. But I was, I think, a rebellious child as I got into my teens and into my older years, and not rebellious for the sake of being rebellious, but rebellious for the sake of pushing boundaries.
Yeah.
So whether it was small things like wanting to go abroad to study, which was sort of unheard of, especially on my father's side of the family, for a girl, an Emirati girl, to go abroad and study alone. That was sort of, for me, you know, pushing the boundary, whether it was, you know, choosing to work in the private sector over the government sector when I came back. Again, wanting to create my own path, I was a rebel in that sense.
Wonderful. I mean, that's where you have been a role model. Were you a very curious person? Were you always asking strange, difficult questions?
Yeah, I think so. I think, again, I don't think I necessarily asked them out loud, per se, but I think I was always wondering. I was always very curious about how certain things worked and why certain people were the way they were and why certain things were accepted as the norm. And why, you know, so I think this questioning of why has actually driven my life. The question is not why, but why not? You know, that's what I always wondered. Why not? Why can't we do these things? And over time, I think that's really what has pushed me over my journey. Is
this some of the things, some of the values that you impart to the young people that are working with you now?
Yes, I mean, you obviously, there's one way, I want to impart those values, but I don't want to enforce or force them to take on values that perhaps are not their own values. But I certainly share my own values with them. And, you know, it comes up especially in conversations, for example, with young girls. My parents won't let me do this, for instance. They won't let me go abroad to study, and I really want to go abroad to study. What should I do? So obviously, I'm not going to say, well, never mind what they say, you know, get on a plane. But at the same time, you know, you want to encourage them to have those conversations with their parents, have the conversation with their family, and to push the boundaries where possible. You know, so that I do try and impart those values, but in a very sensitive way.
You have a wonderful academic career. You at university in the UK, and then you went to Stanford. You want to share a few thoughts and ideas and experiences there? Sure.
Well, my experience in the UK was my first experience abroad. So I had grown up in a very sheltered environment over here. I went to all-girls high school, and then had this amazing experience of living alone. I chose to study computer science. I don't think it was because I was being particularly, far-sighted or, had this vision that, technology would play such an important role in our lives. I think it was just that I had just started to get to know this thing called the internet, and I enjoyed using it. And because there was a lack of career guidance at the time, I didn't really know what else to study. So I thought, well, computer science sounds good enough. I enjoy using the internet. We'll go with that. So academically, I don't think I had the best experience because I don't think I had genuinely explored what I really wanted to do. But just as a personal experience, just living abroad, being independent, I think the amount that I grew in those 3 years, was tremendous. Fast forward a few years later, so I came back, I did work in the private sector at PricewaterhouseCoopers, at Shell for a few years, and then decided to go ahead and study for my master's. And there, I think, of course I was used to living alone at that point, so I was more used to the independence, but I really enjoyed the academic experience because I knew myself, there was more self-awareness. At that point, I was probably 26 years old when I started my MBA. And so I was able to choose the courses and the modules that were of more interest to me, rather than being told exactly what to study.
Stanford is an amazing place, and
you. In fact, it's going to be my 10-year reunion in May.
Okay,
So
brilliant.
it's been a while, but it is an
Yeah.
amazing place, yes.
And so, any sort of nuggets from there? Any people that you met that you were inspired by, saying, "Wow, that's the sort of person I want to be."
Yeah.
Any memories from there?
You know, we were very fortunate at Stanford because of the kinds of, being obviously based in the Bay Area and in Silicon Valley, the kinds of guest speakers that we could attract to campus and the kinds of people you'd be able to hear from. I mean, famously, of course, Steve Jobs, gave one of the commencement speeches at Stanford. So, that was a caliber of people that you would interact with almost on a weekly basis.
Yeah.
It wasn't a once a year thing. There isn't any specific speaker that I can point to, but whether it was the students, whether it was the professors, or whether it was the guest speakers, I found myself constantly inspired to do more and reach for more in an environment like that.
Because in the last 10 years, 12 years since you were there, the world has really, really transformed
Yes.
itself because of Moore's law, because of stuff that's changing, the exponential shifts that are going on.
Yes.
And in these 12 years, you can actually see that huge shift.
Yes.
Do you feel that sort of that energy of change that is around you?
I do feel that energy of change, and especially being based in a university. Again, the Sharjah Entrepreneurship Center is based at the American University of Sharjah, and so we're constantly surrounded by youth. And we've talked about it just briefly before this interview, was the process of reverse mentoring.
Yeah.
And I find that the tables have turned, and I'm learning more from the students and the youth than I know myself. Yeah. So it's really interesting for me. In fact, one of the things we do here at Sheraa is we run an incubator, and a lot of the workshops that we do, whether they're tech workshops or entrepreneurship workshops, are actually led by students. They will self-teach themselves online, on MOOCs, using MOOCs, so on, and actually share those skills with their fellow students and with people like us. So I genuinely feel that times have changed. I need to now keep up with the youth rather than vice versa. Yeah. As you said, with the pace of change, it isn't anymore where you study finance and you become an accountant and you do that for the rest of your life in one company. Things have changed. And in fact, if you ask me, what we look for when we hire here at Sheraa, and even when we are selecting teams for our incubator and accelerator, is a growth mindset. Is that willingness to learn? Is that curiosity? It's in fact, I think, what most employers look for today. So I do think that is very important.
Our culture here, and we have a similar background in some ways, failure is not an option, and we don't grow up, we have to be successful. Our parents have to be proud of the university we've been to and succeeded. How do you cope with that? Because by definition, as an entrepreneur, you will tinker and you will I wouldn't say even fail, but you will go through that learning process. How do you encourage people in that space?
I mean, one of the things is obviously starting as early as possible. While we're based here in a university, we actually do a lot of work with middle school and high school students. So in the last year, for example, we've worked with over 350 girls between the ages of 12 and 17. So the sooner you can inculcate that mindset of just trial and error, the more likely they are to kind of follow the entrepreneurial path. And it's part of the entrepreneurial mindset, irrespective of whether you decide to be an entrepreneur or whether you decide to be a employee in a company. You do need to have that entrepreneurial mindset. So we definitely try to encourage that. Even when we are here at the accelerator and they're starting their startups, we try to tell them to think of every step as an experiment, rather than this big, decision-making moment that, if they don't do well, their venture is going to flop. In fact, one of the teams in the accelerator, with the founder, she was actually supposed to run a workshop here in Sharjah, and she did the usual marketing and so on, and 0 people turned up to her workshop, and obviously she was really upset by that outcome. But rather than let it get her down, she actually reflected on it and wrote a really, really nice blog post about it, reflecting on failure. And she basically, the headline was, "Today my startup failed and today my startup started." Because you need to, actually failure is a part of success. It's not an option. So we really do try and encourage that mindset. Even when we're sharing stories, when we invite guest speakers over, we try to tell them not to just speak about their success stories, but also the times when things didn't quite go according to plan.
It reminds me of this Yale assistant professor, who wrote his failure CV. Even though he was very successful, he's a PhD and an assistant professor at Yale, but he sort of said, "I failed and I learned, I failed and I learned, I failed, I tried this and didn't succeed, and then I changed my direction and I found something fresh."
And as long as you're doing that, as long as you're failing and learning and pivoting, that's the process.
I use the 5 F's of failure. I said fail fast, fail frequently, fail frugally.
Exactly.
Failure is not fatal, and always fail forward.
Exactly, exactly. I think we're going to have to share these 5 F's with the student. I might borrow that model from you.
With pleasure, with pleasure. Now, you did the right thing as a smart, educated MBA from Stanford Emirati girl and came back and joined McKinsey. What was that like?
I actually didn't come back. I stayed in the US.
In the US and you're in McKinsey,
I moved to New York.
Yeah.
That for me, obviously, the learning curve was extremely steep. I wasn't there a long time. I was there about 2 years. I loved the experience. I ended up doing a lot of work in the financial services sector, which has benefited me tremendously because I now sit on the board of a bank. So that experience definitely helped me grow and helped me apply a lot of the skills that I had learned during my MBA and in previous jobs to real client situations. I then left in a couple of years. I decided to come back. So I had been away from the UAE at that point about 4 or 5 years, and I decided I wanted to come back and bring all my learnings home.
Sure.
And I joined the Khalifa Fund in Abu Dhabi, which is basically our national SME development fund, focused on Emirati entrepreneurs. So that was my first step into the world of entrepreneurship and into the world of enabling and empowering others to succeed. And I was there for, again, about 2 or 3 years. And that's when I had my, if you like, my moment of obligation where you start to reflect on, I need to do more. And there's more that I need to give back, and that there are certain situations that I feel that I need to take the first step in trying to change. And one of those situations was, my entire career, whether it had been PwC, Shell, McKinsey, I was always either the only or one of a few Emiratis in those companies. And I never understood why, because the learning and the experience that you get in those companies was tremendous. And so I took it upon myself to kind of start a social enterprise that would provide, and I felt it was primarily a lack of career guidance and awareness. So I took it upon myself to provide more of that through a social enterprise called Khayrat, which means options in Arabic, and to work with young Emiratis to encourage them to explore the private sector rather than jump straight into the government sector.
You broke the mold. You were Emirati, you were a lady, and you were in the private sector. Is that, you were basically, a thought leader and a torchbearer. Do a lot of young girls come to you and say, how did you do that? What is your advice?
A lot of young girls do, as I mentioned earlier. They do come to me, especially being a woman who has pushed the boundaries. My advice to them is always, don't accept things as they are. With each generation, I feel our obligation is to move that boundary a little further and to achieve a little bit more. But it can't be done alone. It can never be done alone. It needs to be done through conversations with with the families, with employers, with the professors and so on. So I always try to say, build that support network to support you as you push those boundaries, and never be afraid to actually follow your passions. That's one of the things that I often think about. When I was 18, 19, as I said, I chose computer science because it felt like that was one of the options, that was the right thing to do. But I do wish I had explored my own personal passions a little bit more, whether it was, for example, writing. Nobody actually said, you could be a writer, for instance, or whatever it may be. So I feel that they should also speak to as many people as possible to understand what the various options are. So like I said, it's through collaboration, it's through conversations that we can actually push these boundaries.
Fast forward to today, you are heading Sheraa here and Khayrat. So those are your 2 initiatives. What sort of makes you jump out of bed in the morning instead of say, I'm going to work? What's that energy that drives you?
I think it's knowing that we're making a difference. And the great thing is, it's not one of those things, it is also one of those things where you see the difference over the long term, but it's also one of those things that you can see the difference in the short term.
Sure.
So, 1 year ago, we didn't exist at Sheraa. We had just launched, in fact, and you were one of our first speakers at Sheraa. And here we are 1 year later with 10 startups that have graduated from Sheraa that are now operating. And will be, for example, at the STEP conference later this week. And some of them have been nominated for prizes. They've been been asked to be interviewed in the media. And so for me, that's a really proud moment that we've taken something that was just an idea in their head, taken that spark and made it into something real. The same with Khayrat, by the way. Again, you start with someone who's a little bit confused, who has the willingness is usually there, but the guidance isn't. And then you see them get into their dream jobs, and it's a wonderful feeling.
What are your views in terms of jobs versus entrepreneurship, and how is that shift happening in the world today?
So I think this is the big discussion at the moment, the future of jobs, and things are definitely changing a lot. One of the things we say over here at Sheraa is to think of yourself as a job creator rather than a job seeker. And I think more and more in the future, people will have to be creating their own jobs. Again, we don't want to force fit entrepreneurship and tell everyone that you're not a success unless you're an entrepreneur. But we do think that the entrepreneurial mindset is really important, and this is why we're continuously offering workshops, irrespective of whether or not they have their own venture that they want to start. But I do think things are changing. You're seeing many more of these micro-entrepreneurs and freelancers, that being the trend, rather than, you look at our forefathers and typically they were lifers in one of the big corporations, for instance. So that's definitely changing.
You're amongst the pioneers to be a director at United Arab Bank, and so when you were looking for people, so if you had a CV arrive on your desk, what would you be looking for on that CV?
I mean, for me, the CV is just one data point. Sometimes I'll interview people without even looking at their CV at all. It's no longer the traditional means of, employment where you present your CV, it has your GPA, and it has a few years of experience, and an offer is made based on that. For me, it's much more about cultural fit. So whether it's at Sheraa or whether it's at the bank, the person being hired needs to fit the culture of the organization. And I go back to curiosity and a growth mindset. With the way things are changing at the moment, nothing is staying the same. And so people that we're hiring they have to have that desire to constantly learn, to grow, and to constantly innovate. So those are the things we usually look for when hiring.
There are so many people in our MENA region and in the UAE also now who are actually worried about their futures. How do you see the future, and what should they be looking forward to?
Well, I think the future is bright. I mean, if I were to take just this generation that I constantly interact with and take them as any indication of what we have in store, I think the future is bright. I think they are a very intelligent generation. I think they're a very driven generation. And what I really love about them is that they're driven not just by money, but to make a positive change. So I think we will be living for sure in a very different world, but I think it's going to be in a very exciting world. But in order for us to comfortably enjoy that world, we need to keep up with it and keep pace with it. And so constantly be learning and renewing ourselves in that sense.
You're a computer scientist, you understand technology, and the rate of change of technology, one of the theses that I have working with IBM Watson is that expertise will get commoditized and all of the soft skills will become the real
even more
thing.
Important,
and
absolutely.
even more important.
Yes.
So anything that cannot be commoditized or digitalized will become 10 times more valuable.
Exactly.
Do you see that realization amongst employers?
I think so. I mean, when we speak to employers, typically they'll say, I think the one thing we hear all the time is there's a skills gap. Funnily enough, on the one hand, unemployment is really high, and on the other hand, you speak to employers and they'll say we can't find the talent we're looking for. So it's a strange situation, and often they'll say that because they say there's a skills gap, and when you ask them what that skills gap is, it's rarely that the technical skills are missing. It's often the emotional skills and the critical thinking skills that we hear are missing. And so one of the things we do here at Sheraa is, like I said, in the incubator, there are 2 tracks of workshops that we have. One is the hard skills, which are the robotics and the coding and so on. But the other track is actually the soft skills, and that's the interpersonal communication, it's the listening skills, active listening, it's how do I approach a stranger and speak to them, how do I go and network, all of these skills are really important, and so we teach both sides of that coin as well.
Tell us your average day. I mean, you come in, you meet crazy people, what actually happens in your life?
I don't think any day is particularly average, but I would say on most days we get to work around 9 a.m. So I am anyway a late riser, and so this works quite well for me. And given that most students are in classes in the morning, we start a little later, but we tend to finish a little later. So we do our events after they're done with their classes. So we'll usually come in the mornings. Often we'll start with a team meeting. So we start the week with a team meeting where we discuss what's going to happen in the coming week and what the long-term plan is for. We usually plan in 3-month cycles. Sure. So what the plan is for the next 3 months, the overview. We then start to, again, it depends. We either are spending time with the students who are in the incubator. So when they're in the incubator, they're working on their product and their prototypes, or spending time, if the accelerator is running, the accelerator runs twice a year, spending time taking those products to market. So the accelerator, in order to get in, you must make your first sale in the incubator. Okay. So we're spending time over there, helping them, introducing them to customers, introducing them to possible, partners. So most of my time is either spent, helping the ventures, or where necessary, obviously, leading the organization, needing to do certain marketing events or publicity and PR and so on.
You're wearing a blue dress, and your blue cape is right behind you. You're Superwoman to a lot of people.
It's missing today.
But on a more serious note, I mean, you are a role model for a lot of young people and a lot of Emirati women. What are the important things that you talk about to them and impart confidence and credibility to them, because you are the role model?
I am not the role model. There are many role model, and I do encourage them to have as many conversations with. One of the things I love is when they reach out to me and actually take that initiative. And I constantly tell them, and if someone does, and often I get these messages on LinkedIn and on Facebook, and I always make it a point to respond to them and actually meet with them in person. And I think that's really important, because I want to encourage them to do that more. If I don't respond, I always feel that they'll take that as a sign that nobody's interested, and so I really kind of take that time to meet with them, to listen to them, and to share my story as openly and as transparently as possible with them. And I encourage them to do that more often with role models, irrespective of whether they are men or women. I think there's things to be learned, as I said, from everybody around us. As I've said in the past, I always try and encourage them to get to know and understand themselves better, and not to be afraid to actually go in or follow in the footsteps of their dreams. And so that's one of the main things that I try and encourage them to do.
Okay. Najla, could you tell us about the business community in Sharjah? And because a lot of people, young people, are looking for jobs and so on. And how do you see things shaping? How do you see them developing?
Well, the business community in Sharjah is thriving, and Sharjah is, trying to position itself now also as a startup hub. So for people who are looking for jobs, obviously one track is entrepreneurship, and a center like Sharjah Entrepreneurship Center can help them not only start their businesses, but actually get licensed and set up in a place like Sharjah. And the fact that we're starting very young means that we can actually do this with students in university, and typically those are the job seekers, or form the majority of the job seekers. The other fact is, of course, a lot of companies based in Sharjah, whether it's sort of Arabia or whether it's leaders in their industry, are constantly looking for talent, and this is one of the first stops that they make, is the university city here in Sharjah, which houses over 20,000 students. I think the one thing that I would say is, in order to kind of help yourself stand out, because there are so many job seekers, is to obviously for example, present yourself in terms of your skills that you offer. When I look at the CVs currently, most graduates have exactly the same CV. I graduated in, for example, bachelor's in business. This is my GPA, and I did an internship. And typically it'll be the place they did their internship, and no information about what they did during their internship, what skills they learned during their internship, and what value that they can add to the business. And I think that's key. I'm constantly telling them it's not about the employer, wanting to just take you on board. It's also what value you can bring to the employer, and you need to highlight that in your conversation, and never feel that you are too young to add value to a business.
Sharjah is also the center of culture and the center of education and so on, and it's beautiful, and the campus is so amazingly beautiful. Do you play a role in that side?
Well, the fact that we're based here, so we're actually an independent entity. We're based here in American University of Sharjah, but we actually work with all the universities in the university city. And so we work closely with the University of Sharjah, the higher colleges of technology, Skyline. So we're constantly working with them on the education component. One of the things that we're trying to do is integrate some of the stuff we're doing into the curriculum. So rather than it being seen as something that's an extracurricular, at least the fundamentals should be part of their curriculum. And again, one of the things that I notice in most of the universities, not just in Sharjah, but genuinely around the world, is there's not enough interaction between the different departments. So if you're in the business school, they're typically always in the business school. They don't meet with the engineering students or the designers and so on. So we're trying to position ourselves as that hub where the talent from all angles, irrespective of what you're studying, can come here and meet each other and then come up with ideas together. So that's the role that we really play as a hub here in the education city. On the culture side, we play a more supportive role. We've actually recently signed with the Al-Midfa Foundation, who obviously have the cultural foundation as well. So we do have a few startups that are in that space, that are in, for example, the design space, one of them in our previous accelerator cohort. And in that sense, we do work with the art foundations and the cultural foundations as well.
Because as we go forward, as we were discussing earlier on in this conversation, was that art and culture and humanity and connection and relationships and collaboration, those will become the valued skills that we have. And some of the greatest cities in the world succeeded because they had poets and artists, and there was a cultural hub combined with the university and learning environment. And I feel that you're beautifully placed for that. So how do we talk about this more? How do we get this out more to kids, saying you don't just need to do computer science, but you also need to do art?
I always feel that when it comes to influencing the younger generation, it's not about talking to them and just kind of telling them. It's also, they need to see successful examples. If the only successful examples that we're highlighting, for instance, are heads of government departments, they'll automatically associate success with that. The more we can showcase role models, whether they are artists, whether they're musicians. In fact, one of the things we did at our launch of the space was we had two artists, one who's a spoken word poet, Afra Atiq, and we also had a young Emirati girl who sang some opera for us. So the reason we did that is because we wanted to showcase the variety of talent in a place like this, and that it's all valued. So it's not that you just need to be an entrepreneur and a successful business person or head a government department in order to be successful, but on the contrary, the arts, the liberal arts field and the performing arts field, these are all valued as well.
As businesses grow, one of the key questions we always encounter is about scale. You can have a lot of young businesses here for 1 or 2 or 3 years and they're mushrooming and growing. But how do you build that scale for them to become from a $1 million dirham company to a 100 million dirham company, and that scale piece, and that's a really important element in that.
I agree that it's an important element, but sometimes, we focus a bit too much on scale. I often say that there's nothing wrong with a small company that employs 10, 15 people, creates jobs for them and is self-sustaining. Not everything needs to grow to be a unicorn. And not everything can grow to be a unicorn realistically either. But having said that, it's a piece that we think about often. So, we, in terms of the journey that we take entrepreneurs on here at Sheraa, it starts with inspiration. So we have inspirational speakers come and inspire the students to think about entrepreneurship. We then have ideation. So a lot of students say that we're interested in entrepreneurship, but we don't really know where to start in terms of getting that idea. So we have an ideation workshop that runs pretty much on a monthly basis. And then the incubator where they're working on their product, on their prototype, and where they need to make that first sale. And then the accelerator, which is all about going to market, business development, and sales. The next step after that would be scaling. So we have two offerings there that I think are relevant. One is something we call the Manassa platform, which is a community of existing SMEs, where we provide networking events for them, but B, also provide workshops for them in terms of, for example, how do I franchise into another country? How do I enter new markets? So those are the kinds of workshops that we provide are much more focused on scaling and growth. We also help them get access to government contracts. So we partner, especially here in Sharjah, with different government entities. One of them is, for example, Sharjah Asset Management, who have committed 5% of their annual procurement to come from our startups. So again, this gives access to market to these entrepreneurs. We've also launched something called the Shabaka Network in partnerships with various universities in the region, whether it's the American University of Cairo or the American University of Beirut or New York University Abu Dhabi. And what this does for us is, aside from being, a great knowledge exchange, it also helps entrepreneurs have a landing pad in various cities, and so that's one of the ways we help them scale as well.
How does one apply to you? Can anybody apply, or do you have to be a student?
So our focus being in the university, especially on the inspiration, ideation and incubation side, is on the students, but when it comes to the accelerator, it's open to pretty much anyone. We do try to have the majority of the teams have at least one person who's graduated from one of the universities in Sharjah.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be, a recent graduate. They may have gone and worked for 3 or 4 years and come back. We do try and have half the teams have that. But if you look at our last accelerator cohort, we had about 3 or 4 teams that actually had no affiliation.
Right.
But we felt that they would add a lot of value to the city,
Yeah.
to the city of Sharjah. And so we take each case on a case-by-case basis, on an individual basis. We speak to the entrepreneurs, understand their ambitions, and if we feel there's a match there, then we're more than happy to bring them into the program. The average age in the last cohort was about 25 years old. And so, and the range was, sort of from early 20s till late 30s. And everything in terms of social enterprises, art-related startups, 70% were tech-enabled. We had at the other end a machine learning, natural language processing startup for Arabic language. So again, a lot of variety, and we try to take 10 per cohort and 2 cohorts per year, and focus more on quality rather than quantity.
You're an extremely successful person. You've reached a beautiful inflection point, and you can grow from there and really just propel yourself into the future. How do you see yourself growing in, say, in the next 10 years?
That's a tough question. It's hard for me to plan beyond a year in advance. But in the next 10 years, honestly, my ambition is, we talked about scale,
yeah.
And I agree. I mean, for me, at least, scaling impact is important. While I love the fact that we are producing 20 startups every year over here, the question that's constantly on my mind is, how the MENA region, we have the highest youth unemployment rate in the world. It stands at 30%. How can we scale a solution like Sheraa, which we're seeing the impact of, but it's only impacting the students around here? How can we scale that to impact students around the region and impact youth around the region? So that I think is something that's on my mind and something I'd like to work towards in the next 10 years, scaling and the impact that we're having, whether it's through Khairat or whether it's through Sheraa. Even Khairat in terms of, right now we're placing, for example, this year, hopefully 100 Emiratis in the private sector, in internships in the private sector. How do you scale that to touch a lot more Emirati lives and the lives of other Arab youth in the region?
What are the sort of things that you do, in your life on a more human level? I mean, on a personal level with family and so on. Do you spend much time?
Yeah. I do make it a point to spend, so Friday afternoons, Friday lunch is typically with the family. I have 4 nieces and nephews as well, so okay. We have my grandmother staying with us, and then my parents and us, and then the grandkids as well. So it's 4 generations that come together, which is a really nice feeling.
Yeah.
And as I've grown older, I've learned to value that a lot more. When you're growing up in your teenage years, you don't want to spend any time with your family. You want to spend all your time with your friends and going out. But as I've grown older, I've learned to really value that family support network. So I do make it a point to try and spend time with them, certainly on weekends. On weekdays, it's a little bit harder because typically on weekdays there are a couple of things that I enjoy doing. One is, for example, on a couple of days a week going boxing. So that's a great way to release some pent-up energy. Occasionally I'll do a little bit of yoga. So some form of physical exercise is usually part of my week. The other thing I enjoy doing is travel. So one of the things that I've picked up in the last couple of years is just going on more adventurous trips rather than the more typical trips. So climbing mountains such as Kilimanjaro, or going on treks like the Everest Base Camp trek, or in Bhutan. So these sorts of things have allowed me to push my own personal boundaries, and really push myself beyond what I thought I was capable of, but has also allowed me to form another nice close-knit group of friends as well to travel with.
Do you like to write poetry? Do you want to be an author? Do you want to be an amazing artist?
Between you and me and anyone watching this video, I do feel that that's one thing that I would really love to do, is someday write a book. I don't know if it would be a novel or whether it would be nonfiction, but when you feel that I wonder if everyone has this feeling. Everyone I speak to says the same thing, but I really feel that I have a story to tell.
Right.
And so whether that happens through a book or some other media, we'll see.
I was going to say another media. If you were a director of a movie,
Yeah.
what would that movie be? And what would that movie be about?
Oh, that's a tough question to ask me on the spot. I have no idea, but I think the message would be a very positive one. And it would hopefully leave a positive impact on the lives of others. I think that's the outcome I'd be looking for.
Let me ask you, fast forward deep into the future. Let's say we put ourselves in a time capsule and we just transport ourselves 50 years from now. This is your sort of 85th birthday, and this place is full of people, and we're all looking at you as a grumpy little granny.
I don't think I'll be a grumpy granny.
No, okay, that's good. Hopefully you'll be a happy granny.
Yeah,
You'll be a gorgeous granny.
Inshallah, yeah.
And as a gorgeous granny, what would we be saying to you and about you? How would we be celebrating your 85th birthday?
I think it'll be a really, I hope it will be a really energetic party. So if we're over here, we'll make sure we make it a night to remember. And I'd love to celebrate. I mean, for me, what I would love is, of course, aside from having family and friends around. And as I said, the older I grow, the more I realize the importance of these relationships, especially these long-term relationships that have really seen you through all the ups and downs that life brings our way. I'd love to also see the lives of the the youth that we're working with today, whether or not they're entrepreneurs. I'm sure they'll be successful in their own right, whether it's as leaders of companies, whether it's as entrepreneurs, whether it's as scientists, artists, musicians, whatever it is. I'd love to see them around and know that in some small way, I had a role to play in their life.
Any last advice that you would like to share with the audience and with young people and parents and employers? Any bit of advice that you'd like to give us?
I think that each person in life has a calling, and the onus is first of all on the individual before anyone else, is to really spend time to get to know what it is that you are passionate about and what your purpose is in life. And then as a support network, whether it's families or whether it's educators, whether it's employers, it's really our role is to help enable these young people, to help them achieve that purpose in life in some small way. And again, Sheraa is one of those examples, Khairat is one of those examples, is really to enable others to achieve success. As you know, Steve Jobs, in the famous Apple ad, The Crazy Ones, there's a story that I love, and I don't know, to be honest, if it's a true story or not, but I've heard it several times in the past. The copy was written by a famous advertising firm, but there was one line in that entire copy that Steve Jobs himself added, which is, they move humanity forward. And I feel that that's what the onus is on each one of us, is that we are here to move humanity forward in some small way, whether it's by bringing up the next generation or coming up with a certain innovation, or whether coming up with certain music and art to make life a better place or make the world a better place. We're all here to move humanity forward, and I think that's something that I would love for each person to kind of keep in mind and to realize that everyone has a purpose. And I feel really fortunate to have had the experiences I've had, to have built the relationships that I've had. We spent every summer abroad growing up, and there's a lot to be grateful for, and there's a lot that we can give back as well. So that's my parting thought.